"You get nothing," Derek's lawyer announced with undisguised satisfaction, sliding a document across the polished conference table during our divorce mediation. "The business is solely in your husband's name, established before marriage, funded independently, and legally separate from marital assets. Mrs. Thornton has no claim to any portion of Thornton Industries." I watched my soon-to-be ex-husband smirk from across the table, sitting beside my former best friend Vanessa, whose engagement ring, purchased while we were still married, caught the overhead lights like a deliberate taunt. What Derek didn't know, what his expensive attorney had completely failed to discover, was that the independent funding that had built his precious company had come from an investment account I'd established under my maiden name 3 years before our wedding. My attorney, Patricia, waited for the dramatic pause to settle. Then she slid her own documents across the table. "Your client's company has $4.2 million in outstanding loans through Sullivan Capital Partners," Patricia said calmly. "My client is the sole proprietor of Sullivan Capital Partners. The loans were structured with specific performance clauses and are callable on demand." She paused. "Payment is due immediately." The smirk disappeared from Derek's face. "That's not possible," he said. "My investors are Sullivan Capital Partners, which is wholly owned by Evelyn Sullivan Thornton, your wife. The wife whose inheritance you just claimed has no connection to your business." Derek's lawyer was already flipping through the documents, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. It would mean that if Mr. Thornton cannot repay $4.2 million immediately, my client can seize the assets used as collateral, which, according to these loan agreements your client signed, includes a 60% stake in Thornton Industries. The room went silent. Vanessa was staring at me with something approaching horror. Derek had gone pale. I smiled. "Should we continue discussing what I'm entitled to?" The story of how I became my husband's secret investor began long before our marriage. I'd inherited money from my grandmother when I was 22. Not a fortune by billionaire standards, but a comfortable $2 million that I'd been wise enough to invest rather than spend. Under the guidance of a family friend who worked in finance, I'd learned to manage my portfolio, eventually forming Sullivan Capital Partners as a vehicle for private investments. I'd met Derek 3 years later at a networking event where he was pitching his construction technology startup to potential investors. He'd been charming, ambitious, full of ideas that actually made sense. I'd been intrigued, both by the business opportunity and by the man himself. I'd invested $500,000 through Sullivan Capital, keeping my ownership anonymous. It wasn't deception, it was prudent business practice. I wanted the investment to succeed or fail on its own merits, not because the founder was dating the investor. When Derek and I started seeing each other romantically, I'd kept the investment separate. When he proposed, I'd planned to tell him the truth. But something had held me back, a small voice warning me to wait, to see how the marriage developed before revealing this particular card. That voice, it turned out, had been prescient. The marriage had been good for the first 5 years. Derek's company grew steadily, and I'd provided additional funding through Sullivan Capital as the business expanded, always structured as formal loans with proper documentation. Derek never questioned where the money came from. His CFO handled investor relations, and I'd been careful to maintain the fiction of an institutional investor. At home, I supported his career in visible ways, hosting client dinners, attending industry events, being the perfect entrepreneur's wife. Meanwhile, I continued managing my own investments quietly, building Sullivan Capital into a respectable fund that Derek knew nothing about. "You should do something with your time," he'd said occasionally. "Take up a hobby. Maybe volunteer work." I'd smiled and nodded, declining to mention that my hobby was managing a $15 million investment portfolio. Then Vanessa had entered our lives. She'd been my friend first. We'd met at a charity function, bonded over shared interests, become close confidants. I'd introduced her to Derek at one of our dinner parties, never imagining what would grow between them. The affair had started 2 years ago. I'd suspected for months before confirming it. The late nights, the distracted conversations, the way Derek looked at his phone when he thought I wasn't watching. When I'd confronted him, he hadn't even bothered denying it. "Vanessa understands me in ways you never did," he'd said. "She supports my vision. You're just comfortable. Safe. I need passion. I've been supporting your vision for 8 years. You've been hosting dinner parties. That's not the same thing." I'd wanted to tell him then about the investments, the loans, the $4.2 million that had built his precious company. But rage and hurt had clouded my judgment, and something colder had taken over. Let him believe I was nothing. Let him underestimate me completely. Then, when the moment was right, I'd show him exactly what he'd thrown away. The divorce proceedings had been Derek's idea of strategic warfare. He'd hired the most aggressive family lawyer in the city, a man known for protecting wealthy husbands from gold-digging wives. He'd moved assets, restructured accounts, done everything possible to minimize what I'd receive in the settlement. His strategy relied on one fundamental assumption: that I was a dependent spouse with no independent resources. He'd demanded the house, the vacation property, the investment accounts that were in his name. He'd offered me a pittance, $200,000 in alimony spread over 5 years, take it or leave it. Your wife has no income, no career, no assets of her own, his lawyer had argued. She's entitled to support, certainly, but not to assets she contributed nothing to acquire. The irony had been almost unbearable. For 8 years, I'd funneled millions into Derek's company while he dismissed me as a decorative housewife. Every expansion, every new contract, every successful project had been funded by money I'd provided, and he'd never acknowledged. He thought I was entitled to nothing. He was about to discover he was wrong. The mediation session collapsed into chaos after Patricia's revelation. Derek's lawyer demanded time to verify the documentation. Derek himself was alternating between rage and denial. Vanessa had excused herself to the bathroom and hadn't returned. "This is fraud," Derek finally sputtered. "She deceived me about her identity." "Your client signed loan agreements with Sullivan Capital Partners," Patricia interrupted. "The agreements are legally binding regardless of who owns the lending company. The terms are clear: repayment on demand, assets as collateral. Whether your client knew his wife owned the lender is irrelevant. She should have disclosed. Mr. Thornton, my client had no legal obligation to disclose her investment activities to her husband. Many couples maintain separate finances. There's nothing fraudulent about a woman managing her own inherited wealth. But she used it to provide favorable loan terms that allowed your client's company to grow, to support his business ambitions while he repeatedly dismissed her contributions." Patricia's voice hardened. "My client could have called these loans years ago. She didn't, because she believed in the marriage and wanted the business to succeed. Now that Mr. Thornton has chosen to end the marriage and claims she's entitled to nothing, she's simply exercising her contractual rights." Derek turned to me, his face contorted with something between fury and fear. "You planned this. From the beginning, you planned this. I invested in your company because I believed in you. I kept investing because I believed in us. I didn't plan for you to have an affair with my best friend and then try to leave me with nothing." I met his eyes steadily. "That was your plan, Derek. I'm just responding to it." The negotiations that followed were very different from what Derek had anticipated. His lawyer quickly realized that fighting the loans would be catastrophic. If I called them immediately, the company would be forced into liquidation or bankruptcy. Even if Derek could find alternative financing, unlikely, given the circumstances, the disruption would damage client relationships and ongoing projects. "My client is willing to negotiate," his lawyer said carefully. "Perhaps we can structure a repayment plan." "My client is willing to convert the loans to equity," Patricia countered. "She'll accept a 51% ownership stake in Thornton Industries in lieu of repayment." "That's insane. The company is currently valued at approximately $12 million. My client's loans, with accrued interest, total $4.7 million. A 51% stake is generous under the circumstances. She could demand full repayment and force liquidation instead." Derek's lawyer conferred with him in urgent whispers. I watched the power dynamic shift in real time. The man who'd walked in convinced he held all the cards, now realizing he held none. "We need time to consider. You have until end of business tomorrow. After that, the loans are called." The final settlement was signed 3 weeks later. I received 51% ownership of Thornton Industries, plus the house, which Derek had claimed he wanted but couldn't afford to keep, plus a structured buyout of my remaining stake over 10 years. In total, the divorce netted me over $8 million in assets and ongoing income. Derek received the privilege of continuing to run a company he no longer controlled, under the supervision of a board that now included my representatives. Vanessa received exactly what she'd bargained for: a man who'd betrayed his wife and lost his empire in the process. They married 6 months after our divorce was finalized. From what I've heard, the relationship has been strained, surprising no one except perhaps them. Building a life on a foundation of betrayal rarely produces stable results. The aftermath raised questions I still grapple with. Had I been wrong to keep my investments secret? Had I deceived Derek as fundamentally as he'd deceived me? I've thought about it extensively, discussed it with therapists and friends. The conclusion I've reached is this. I kept my financial life private because Derek never showed interest in it. I maintained separate accounts because he never asked about them. I was a silent investor because he preferred me silent. His ignorance of my wealth was a product of his own assumptions. His belief that I was incapable of anything beyond hostessing duties. He never asked what I did with my inheritance. He never inquired about my investments. He dismissed me so completely that he couldn't imagine me as a financial peer. That's not my deception. That's his blindness. 1 year after the divorce, Derek requested a meeting. I agreed, curious what he wanted. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop neither of us frequented. He looked diminished. The swagger was gone, replaced by something more uncertain. I wanted to apologize, he said. Not for the affair, I know you'll never forgive that. But for how I saw you, how I treated you. Go on. I spent 8 years thinking I was the one building everything. The success, the company, the life we had. I thought you were just along for the ride. I never considered that you might be building something too. You never asked. I never asked. He nodded. I was so focused on my own story that I couldn't imagine you had won. That was arrogant. Stupid. Yes, it was. The business isn't doing well under your board's oversight. The business is doing exactly as well as your leadership deserves. The board is simply holding you accountable in ways I should have years ago. Is this revenge? The way you're running things now? I considered the question. No, this is investment management. I put $4.2 million into your company. I have a right to ensure it's managed responsibly. If that feels like revenge, perhaps you should examine why responsible oversight seems punitive. He didn't have an answer to that. 3 years have passed since the divorce. Thornton Industries has stabilized under reformed leadership. Derek eventually accepted that the board's oversight was improving rather than hindering operations. The company is profitable, well-managed, and positioned for growth. I've stepped back from direct involvement, focusing on new investments through Sullivan Capital. The fund has grown substantially. The publicity from the divorce, which became a minor sensation in business circles, actually attracted new clients who appreciated my strategic acumen. Vanessa reached out once, attempting to apologize. I declined the meeting. Some betrayals don't warrant reconciliation. And Derek, to his credit, has stopped fighting. He runs the company, I own the majority, and we communicate through intermediaries when necessary. It's not friendship, it never will be, but it's functional. He filed for divorce thinking I was worthless. He discovered I'd been his foundation all along. My husband wanted to marry my best friend and leave me with nothing. He didn't know I'd been his company's silent investor. Now he knows. And that knowledge, more than any settlement, was the justice I needed.